At 30,000 feet, Flight 417 was supposed to be nothing more than the first vacation Nolan Reed had given himself in years. A single father, a quiet seat, no weapon, no badge. When three strangers seized the passenger cabin, the cockpit went dark, and the plane banked hard away from its course. Every soul aboard lost hope in the same instant. But Nolan had already seen what no one else noticed. These men were not after the airplane. They were not after money. They were hunting one specific passenger, and if they found her first, none of them would ever land. Stay until the end to find out whether Nolan saves the flight, or whether his past destroys everything he has left. Nolan Reed arrived at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport 40 minutes before boarding with the low-grade unease of a man who had spent nearly 12 years understanding exactly what could go wrong inside a pressurized aluminum tube moving at 500 miles an hour above the Earth, and now had to pretend that knowledge belonged to someone else. He was 42 years old, wide-shouldered, with the kind of stillness that read as quiet in a crowd but registered differently to anyone trained to notice it. The stillness of someone who is never entirely off duty, even when he desperately wants to be. 4 years had passed since he handed in his credentials with the Federal Air Marshal Service. 4 years since a mission went sideways in ways he had replayed 10,000 times since, and he had spent every one of those years in Tacoma, telling himself the distance was healthy. The terminal was loud and crowded, smelling of coffee and jet fuel, and Nolan stood near the departure gate with his single carry-on bag and a boarding pass for seat 19A, trying to feel like a man going on vacation and mostly failing. He had called his daughter Claire before leaving the house, and she had laughed at him before he finished his first sentence, because she could already hear the reluctance in his voice. She was 15 and knew her father better than most adults in his life, and she had delivered her verdict with the easy certainty of someone who had spent years watching him sacrifice convenience for caution. She told him that a man could not protect the people he loved by spending his whole life afraid of living, and that she needed him to come back with at least one photograph of something that wasn't a security perimeter. Nolan had promised to try, which was as close to a real commitment as he could manage, and she had accepted it because she understood what it cost him. He thought about that phone call as he settled into seat 19A, a window-adjacent position on the port side of the cabin, roughly at the midpoint of the fuselage, not chosen by accident. Flight 417 was a commercial route from Seattle to Washington, D.C., a full cabin, a normal flight plan, nothing on the manifest that should have snagged his attention. And yet the habit did not switch cleanly the way he had always hoped it might, with enough time away from the service, because within 12 minutes of boarding, he had already marked 3 passengers whose behavior patterns did not align with their apparent circumstances. The first was a man in a gray blazer who had already shifted seats twice without any visible reason and carried a single slim briefcase that he never checked and never opened, holding it instead across his knees with the kind of watchfulness that belonged to a courier rather than a traveler. The second was a younger man in a contractor's lanyard whose work boots were clean in a way that no airport technician's boots ever are. No grease, no scoring on the toe caps, no wear pattern that matched the kind of hard surface work the badge implied. The third was a larger man near the forward bulkhead who spent more time studying the cockpit door than anything else around him, and whose breathing slowed and steadied the way a trained person's breathing does when they are performing a mental rehearsal. Nolan registered all 3 in the way he registered temperature changes, automatically, without drama, and then he registered a 4th person, a woman seated 2 rows behind him, dressed plainly but expensively, who flinched each time someone passed her row in a way that was just slightly too controlled to be ordinary nervousness. Mara Ellison, the head flight attendant, moved through the cabin with the precise efficiency of someone who had memorized every face on the manifest and was already running her own quiet accounting, and she passed Nolan's row and paused almost imperceptibly when their eyes met before moving on without a word, and Nolan understood from that pause alone that she had noticed him the same way he had noticed the others. The aircraft pushed back on schedule, taxied without incident, and lifted cleanly off the runway into a low gray Seattle sky, and for 9 minutes Nolan watched the city shrink below him and told himself he was a civilian now, a father on a rare solo trip, a man who had given his debt to that world and been released from it. Then the cabin lights blinked once. The entertainment system cycled off without warning, and the young man with the clean boots stood up and walked toward the aft galley with the particular purposefulness of someone who was not going to the restroom. The sequence unfolded in under 90 seconds, which was about how long a well-rehearsed team needed if every person was already in position and no one hesitated. The entertainment system stayed dark, and a tone that the cabin crew would have recognized as a maintenance signal sounded once and cut off, which was not how maintenance signals behaved on a functioning aircraft, and the woman in the aisle seat near the emergency exit started crying before anyone else understood that something had changed, because she had understood it first in the way some people understand disaster before the language catches up. Blake Harlan was on his feet before the tone finished, not running, not raising his voice, not doing anything that would have looked alarming from the front of the cabin, simply moving forward with a confidence that separated the aisle the way a moving object separates water. Derek Sloan staged a loud, escalating disagreement with the passenger next to him on the port side, turning heads, pulling focus, making noise that was specifically calibrated to divide attention at the moment. Blake reached the forward galley and told Mara Ellison in a voice just above a whisper that the aircraft was no longer operating under its original authority. Blake announced to the cabin what he needed them to understand, without what he did not need them to panic over, which was the mark of someone who had done threat management professionally, and knew that a frightened crowd is harder to control than a compliant one. He said there was a device in the cargo hold, that no one would be harmed if the crew cooperated, and that Captain Grant Holloway had already been contacted and would be making a course adjustment shortly, delivered in the measured tone of a man who expected to be believed, and was. He did not shout, he did not produce a weapon, and he did not touch anyone, and the cabin went quiet in the particular way that full silence follows something that cannot be undone. And Mara stood very still near the galley door, and Nolan watched her from row 19 and saw that she was not afraid in the way civilians become afraid. She was performing stillness while cataloging, which was a skill she had developed across 15 years of managing air emergencies, and the catalog she was building was the same one he was building. Nolan did not stand up. 2 passengers in the rows ahead of him turned to look at him with expressions that held varying portions of disbelief and accusation, as though a man of his size and apparent fitness had an obligation to do something immediately, and he let them look, because he understood something they did not. Acting before he knew the complete shape of the threat was the reason a woman had been hurt on a tarmac in Phoenix 4 years ago. And he was not going to let that calculus produce the same answer twice. So he sat and watched, because watching was not passivity, but the most important thing he could do in the first 3 minutes of something like this, and what he saw told him more than any amount of rapid action could have. Blake examined the passenger manifest that Mara had been required to hand over, and he did not look at it the way someone looks at a document they want to study. He looked at it the way someone looks for a specific entry, skimming quickly, eyes moving in the vertical pattern of a search rather than the horizontal pattern of reading. And he was looking at the entries for women traveling alone, which narrowed the field considerably. Derek moved to the aft section of the cabin and collected phones and identification documents in a plastic tray with an efficiency that confirmed he had been briefed on the cabin layout in advance, which meant the planning had involved information that only someone with system access could have provided. Trent held position near the service panel at the rear bulkhead, working with a small device that Nolan could not see clearly, but that was consistent with signal suppression hardware. And when Nolan looked up at the cockpit indicator light above the forward bulkhead, it had changed from the steady blue of normal operation to the amber of an override condition. When the identification tray reached the woman 2 rows behind him, Nolan watched her remove her documents with one hand while the other slid something small and metal from her finger and pushed it carefully into the gap between the seat cushion and the armrest. And he understood in that moment that the woman in the plain expensive clothes was not on this aircraft by accident, and that neither were the 3 men who had just seized it. Blake announced that somewhere on the aircraft a passenger was traveling under a false name, and that he intended to find that person before the flight reached its revised destination. Nolan tipped his water glass deliberately as Mara came down the aisle with a cloth, a small piece of staged clumsiness that gave him approximately 4 seconds to speak into the space between her shoulder and the headrest while she crouched beside his row, and he used those 4 seconds to confirm his background and ask her to maintain the calm she was already performing, which she received with a single barely visible nod that told him she had understood both the confirmation and the request. The phrase he used was one that the Federal Air Marshal Service had circulated internally for exactly this kind of situation. A combination of words that would mean nothing to anyone outside the training program and everything to someone who had attended the annual cabin threat protocols that commercial flight attendants undergo on a regular basis. Mara did not ask his name or his clearance level. She simply stood, straightened, and moved forward with the cloth, and Nolan knew she would be watching Blake's eyes instead of his hands for the rest of the flight. Blake had reached the section of the manifest that contained women traveling under business designation bookings, and the set of his jaw had changed slightly, which was what a person's jaw does when a search is not returning the result they were trained to find. He worked through the identification documents, one by one, efficient and unhurried, and when he reached the woman in the plain expensive clothes, she handed him a driver's license and looked back at him without blinking. And for a moment the interaction balanced on a knife point, and then Blake moved on. And Nolan exhaled very slowly and began thinking about what it meant that her documentation had passed a visual check without triggering recognition. The name on the license was not her legal name. He was almost certain of that, and the photograph matched the woman's current appearance because she was disciplined and had maintained it, but the name would not match any record Blake might try to cross-reference, which meant she had planned this level of concealment before she ever booked the flight. Vivienne Ashford sat 2 rows behind him and slightly to the right, and her hands were clasped on her knees with a steadiness that was not natural but was practiced. The way a surgeon's hands look steady because they have been trained rather than because fear has been eliminated. Nolan leaned back and said, at a volume that traveled exactly 1 row, that the argument about the window shade was settled as far as he was concerned, and she could keep it however she liked, which was nonsensical on its face, but gave her a reason to look at him, without it appearing that she was seeking help. She held his gaze for 2 seconds and then looked away, and in those 2 seconds he read assessment without trust, intelligence without information, and the specific composure of someone who was performing the same calculation he was. He said, just above a whisper, that whatever she was hiding from the man with the manifest was the actual reason for this flight's current situation, and that if she planned to keep hiding it, she needed to know that the man checking documents had a target profile, and she matched it, and the document she had handed him had bought time but not safety. She told him to mind his own affairs in a tone pitched perfectly to sound like irritated seat neighbor fatigue, and he almost smiled because the tone was exactly right. And then he told her about the ring, the one she had slipped from her finger and tucked into the seat cushion gap, the one with the small embossed insignia that he had recognized because he had spent 6 months 2 years ago evaluating the security arrangements of a subsidiary in the Ashford aeronautics supply chain. The composure cracked by perhaps 2 degrees, which was the most he was going to get, and then she said he was going to get them both killed, and he said that was precisely what he was trying to prevent. He told her he needed to know one thing. Was the device she was carrying on her person, or was it somewhere in the aircraft's storage that could be found? She looked at him for a long moment and said it was on her person. He told her to keep it there, and to deny its existence to anyone who asked, and that she should not volunteer her real name under any circumstances, because the men who had taken this aircraft already knew she was aboard. They simply did not know which seat she was in. Blake announced that someone on the aircraft was traveling under a false name, that he was aware of this, and that he intended to identify that person before the flight reached its revised destination. The announcement was delivered in the same calm register as everything else he said, which made it more frightening than a shout would have been, because it carried the credibility of someone who does not announce things they are not prepared to follow through on. The cabin shifted in emotional temperature without the air handling system changing at all, which was what a roomful of frightened people felt like when the fear became collective, and several passengers began looking at the people around them with the particular suspicion that fear creates when it needs somewhere to land. Nolan calculated the time remaining before Blake's systematic review would produce a discrepancy he could not explain away, and the number he arrived at was not comfortable. He made a decision that looked like no decision at all, which was to remain seated and do nothing, and he accepted the cost of that appearance because he understood cost in a way that earlier versions of himself had not. On a tarmac at Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport, he had seen a threat and moved toward it with the certainty of someone who had trained for exactly that scenario. And he had been right about the threat and wrong about the timing, because there was a second actor he had not fully confirmed, and that second actor had heard a woman named Diane Pierce, who spent 11 days in a hospital because Nolan moved 90 seconds before the full picture was available. The investigation cleared him, concluded his actions were within protocol, and that the outcome, while grievous, did not represent a failure of training. And Nolan had read that conclusion and understood that official vindication and personal accountability were not the same document, and had been living with that distinction ever since. So he sat, and he spent the next 20 minutes constructing what he needed to construct, which was not a plan for his own action, but a distributed system of eyes and hands and reliable people who could act in coordination when the moment came. Mara Ellison was already his most important resource. She moved through the cabin under the cover of her professional role and could position herself anywhere without arousing suspicion, and she understood from the exchange in the aisle that he was building something and that she was part of it. Tobias Lane was a man in the middle section who had introduced himself to his neighbors before takeoff as an emergency nurse, which Nolan had filed away without knowing he would need it. A quiet conversation conducted through the pretense of sharing a charging cable established that Tobias was willing and experienced enough to manage medical situations in a moving aircraft. Henry Cole sat 3 rows forward, retired aerospace systems engineer, a fact established by the conference lanyard he still wore, and the technical periodical open on his tray table. and a folded piece of napkin passed hand to hand through 4 intermediaries told Nolan within 7 minutes that Henry did not believe the cargo hold threat was physically plausible, given the aircraft's configuration and the timeline the hijackers had described. Blake brought Vivian to the forward section of the cabin under the explanation that he wanted to clarify an inconsistency in her documentation, and Nolan watched her walk forward between Blake and Derek with the measured pace of someone who was buying time at every step, and he did not move, and Vivian looked back at him over her shoulder with an expression that was part accusation and part calculation, and he held her gaze steadily enough that she might understand, or might not, that his stillness was not abandonment but architecture. He heard her voice from the forward section a few minutes later, modulated and controlled, answering questions about her itinerary in a way that generated more questions than it settled, which was exactly the right approach if she understood that she was not being interrogated, but being stalled toward a conclusion that was already written. In the middle of the cabin, unobserved by any of the 3 hijackers, Trent Gable looked at his watch for the 6th time in 4 minutes and sweated in a way that had nothing to do with the cabin temperature. Blake ordered a secondary pass through the entire passenger cabin, a full sweep of identification and a visual confirmation of every row, because he had reached the point where the evidence of absence told him more than what he had collected, and the evidence of absence was suggesting that his target had better documentation than his brief had accounted for. He moved through the cabin with Derek while Trent remained at the aft service station, the sweep thorough and unhurried, managed with the professional detachment of someone who understood that systematic scrutiny was its own kind of pressure, that sitting under a methodical search was harder on a person than being confronted directly. Nolan understood all of this because he had spent the past 40 minutes studying Blake the way you study a board game opponent. Not looking for the next piece that could be taken, but for the configuration that revealed the underlying strategy. He asked Derek for permission to move to the restroom because he felt unwell, and he said it with the apologetic embarrassment of a person who is genuinely uncomfortable making the request, and Derek denied it with the contemptuous authority of someone who had made the calculation that Nolan was irrelevant. A big, frightened middle-aged man in an unremarkable jacket who had spent the last hour sitting very still. And the contempt was exactly what Nolan had been working to earn, because contempt and dismissal are the same protection as invisibility. He was refused and returned to his seat and used the next 11 minutes to pass information through the network he had assembled, using Mara as the primary relay, and what moved through that network in whispered fragments and folded notes was a plan built not around what Nolan could do alone, but around what each of them could do in a window of time that he was going to create. Henry Cole had confirmed through technical assessment that the cargo hold threat was either substantially less dangerous than presented or was not a conventional device at all. The claim contained inconsistencies with what the aircraft model could physically accommodate, and the timing of the announcement suggested it was designed to produce compliance rather than to describe a real condition. Nolan shared this with Mara and asked her to hold it, because the information was most useful when deployed at the right moment, rather than distributed broadly to a cabin that might react in ways that eliminated the element of surprise. Vivian, in the forward section, was extending the interrogation with the specific skill of someone who had spent 2 decades in boardrooms managing people who wanted things she did not intend to give them. She acknowledged Blake's authority in the room without conceding information, and she reframed each direct question into a broader topic that he then had to narrow again, and every cycle of that exchange cost him 3 to 4 minutes. Trent was the variable Nolan had identified earliest and was watching most carefully now, because Trent did not look like a man executing a plan. He looked like a man enduring one, which was a different psychological profile with different pressure points, and he flinched when Blake changed the timeline and miscounted the rows on his first sweep and had to restart, and his eyes moved to the exits with the frequency of someone who was already considering scenarios in which the exit was the relevant feature. Nolan began speaking to him, not in a conversation but in the way you speak to someone from 20 feet away without appearing to speak to them at all. A remark about the turbulence meant for the passenger beside him, an observation about the cloud cover outside. And across 4 of these ambient observations, he established a register of calm that Trent's nervous system began to track the way a frightened animal tracks something quiet and non-threatening in a noisy environment. He said, at one point in the middle of a mundane statement about the weather, that people who followed orders in situations like this one generally found that those orders stopped protecting them the moment the operation changed shape, and he said it in a tone of simple observation rather than accusation, and he watched Trent's hands go still on the service panel for just a moment before resuming their habitual checking. Captain Grant Holloway's voice came over the cabin speaker system with the controlled evenness of someone who had been flying commercially for 31 years and would describe a hurricane in the same register that he described a beverage service, and he said they were beginning a course correction and that passengers should remain seated with safety belts secured, and the course correction was east toward Montana, which told Nolan the cockpit was operating entirely on the information Blake had provided. Derek found the ring. He had been working through the seat pockets and gap spaces in the rows near where Vivienne had been sitting, methodical in the way that someone with a military background performs a search even when he does not want to be doing it, and the small gold ring with the embossed insignia came out of the seat cushion gap in row 21 with the quality of a conclusion, final and irreversible. He brought it to Blake at the forward section, and Blake looked at it for 3 seconds, and then he looked at the passenger in row 19A who had been sitting very quietly for the entire flight, and something in his assessment of that quietness shifted, the way a landscape shifts when you understand that what you took for a hill is the edge of something else entirely. Nolan stood and spoke before Blake could form his next instruction. Because the moment for concealment had passed, and candor was now the more useful tool, and because Trent was closest enough to hear everything. He described the operation's structure from the outside, the course diversion, the ground team waiting at the decommissioned airfield in eastern Montana, the signal suppression, cutting the aircraft's secondary communication systems, the fact that Preston Caldwell's operational security had one consistent vulnerability across every action he had taken in 3 decades, which was that he hired people he could control financially rather than people he could trust institutionally, and those were not the same category. He explained that the absence of an extraction plan for the hijacking team was not an oversight but a feature, that a man like Caldwell did not maintain witnesses to illegal activity when the activity had concluded, and he said this in the patient tone of someone sharing an analysis rather than making an argument, and he watched Trent's face across the row and saw the calculation happening. Derek went through Nolan's jacket pockets and found the commemorative coin, a Federal Air Marshal Service Challenge coin, issued at service milestones, which Nolan had carried since his 4th year and never been able to leave at home even after he left the job. Blake looked at it, then looked at Nolan with an expression of retroactive reassessment, and asked why a former air marshal had spent the better part of an hour behaving like a frightened civilian, and Nolan told him he had been waiting to see which of the 3 of them would make the first significant error, and that the answer had turned out to be Derek. Blake decided that Nolan was more useful as a presence near Vivienne than as an unknown variable in the cabin, and had him moved forward, which placed them within conversational range for the first time since the operation began. Vivienne looked at him with the expression of someone conducting a difficult negotiation who has just been joined by a person whose role is not clear. He told her briefly that the ground team was real, that the cargo hold device was almost certainly not what had been described, that Trent Gable was the weakest point in the operational structure, and that the timeline was compressing because the aircraft was burning more fuel at its diverted altitude. She asked whether he had a complete plan or was still building one, and he told her the honest answer, that he had a framework and needed her to hold Blake's attention for another 30 minutes without conceding the storage device's location. She absorbed this without visible reaction and turned back to Blake and resumed the conversation she had been having, and Nolan thought that whoever had underestimated this woman had made a serious and expensive mistake. Then Trent moved close and said, barely above breath, that the device in the cargo hold was not what Blake had described, not an explosive, not the threat it had been presented as, and that he had not understood when he was hired that the operation would end with people being taken off an aircraft against their will. Nolan told Trent that cooperation now, before the aircraft landed, was the difference between a federal charge that carried consequences he did not want to think through and an agreement that a motivated attorney could work with, and he said it without urgency or pressure, because urgency and pressure were exactly the wrong tools for someone who was already afraid and needed to believe that the choice in front of him was rational rather than coerced. He told him that the device he had installed could be rendered inactive through a specific sequence that would restore the secondary communication systems, and that doing so would allow the flight crew to confirm their actual position and status to air traffic control, which would shorten the window in which the ground team in Montana could operate without federal awareness. Trent asked what would happen to him after, and Nolan told him truthfully that it depended on what he provided and how he provided it, and that there were no guarantees from a man with no current authority, but that the alternative to trying was a certainty that was not in his favor. Blake received a call through the satellite phone he carried, and the change in his expression was subtle, but available to anyone watching at the right angle. And Nolan was watching at the right angle. The call lasted under 2 minutes, and when it ended, Blake stood very still in the forward section for a moment with the look of someone revising a fundamental assumption, and then he looked at Nolan and Vivienne with a quality of attention that had changed its basis, no longer calculating how to use them, but calculating what they represented as a liability. Preston Caldwell had altered the mission parameters in a way that added Nolan to the category of people who could not depart the aircraft in possession of what they currently knew, and Blake was now holding an operation that had become substantially more dangerous for him personally than it had been when the aircraft left Seattle. And he understood this with the clarity of someone who has spent a professional life assessing exactly this kind of calculation. Leah Foster's voice came through the cockpit interphone in a fragment that Mara caught in the forward galley. The co-pilot was describing instrument readings that did not match the aircraft's actual mechanical state, and she had identified the source of the discrepancy as a signal generated externally to the flight management system, meaning someone aboard was feeding false data to the cockpit displays, which was more dangerous than a simple communication blackout. Mara relayed this to Nolan through the interphone under the cover of a routine status report, and Nolan passed it to Henry Cole, and Henry spent 4 minutes with it and passed back a location estimate for the interference hardware. Mara created a medical situation at the rear of the cabin, a passenger experiencing symptoms that required immediate assistance. And the performance was convincing because Mara was a professional who had managed genuine in-flight emergencies and knew exactly what the real version looked like. And it pulled Derek from his position near the mid-cabin emergency exit to the rear galley, where the situation required his physical presence. In those minutes, Nolan spoke to Trent, confirmed the deactivation sequence, and told Henry Cole through Mara which technical steps to describe so that a non-engineer could perform the disconnection safely at the aft service panel. The plan was not elegant, and it depended on a young man who was frightened doing a difficult thing in a moving aircraft under time pressure, which was not the kind of plan Nolan would have endorsed in a training scenario, but training scenarios had access to resources that this aircraft did not. Then Derek came back up the aisle and saw Trent's hands at the aft service panel and understood what he was seeing before Blake did, and he announced it to the cabin in the loud, fracturing voice of someone whose composure had finally exceeded its design tolerance. And the word he used was betrayal, which was accurate enough. Derek's announcement broke the operational discipline that Blake had maintained across the entire flight with considerable skill, and the breaking of it was immediate and consequential. Derek moved toward Trent with the intention of stopping him. Blake moved to intercept Derek because he understood that Trent's work was still necessary, and the three-way fragmentation of the hijack team's coordination created exactly the kind of distributed chaos that Nolan had been building toward, but had not expected to arrive this way or this fast. He gave Mara the signal they had agreed on, a request for a cabin status check in a specific phrasing, and the overhead lighting shifted to its reduced intensity setting under the explanation of weather precautions, which was the instruction Mara had pre-positioned with the flight deck through a channel she had kept open at considerable personal cost. The cabin dropped into a dimmer state that changed the visual dynamics of the space in ways that favored people who knew what they were looking for. Vivian stood up from her seat in the forward section without being asked to, without being prompted or coordinated with, because she had been building her own timing across the previous 20 minutes and had identified the same moment Nolan had identified. And she announced in a voice pitched to carry through the full cabin that she would give Blake what he was looking for if he released Trent from whatever he intended to do to him, and the announcement was delivered with the authority of a person who has chaired board meetings and managed personnel decisions affecting many hundreds of people, and it landed with exactly the weight she intended. Blake turned from Derek, and his full attention went to Vivian, which was what she was offering him, and in the seconds that followed, Nolan moved. He came at Derek from the angle that the reduced lighting and Derek's own forward momentum had opened, and the resolution of that encounter was quick and unglamorous. A controlled, close-quarters hold executed the way someone executes something they trained for hundreds of times and have not forgotten despite 4 years away from active service, and Tobias Lane came from 2 rows over and joined the effort, and 2 other passengers who had been positioned through Mara's relay system added their weight, and Derek was on the floor of the aisle, held by people who were not professionals but were cooperative and sufficient. Trent ran for the aft panel and began the disconnection process that Henry had described, and Nolan heard him counting under his breath in the specific way that someone counts when they are reading instructions simultaneously, which was the sound of someone doing something difficult and doing it correctly. Blake pulled Vivian toward the aft portside service door and held the satellite phone against the bulkhead in a way that suggested he was managing the presence of a device he was not ready to use, and he told the cabin that he had a manual override for a system that would produce results none of them wanted, and that he was giving Nolan 3 minutes to stand down and return to his seat, and that the choice was between one person walking off the aircraft at the landing site or all of them facing consequences that only he could prevent. Nolan looked at him across 20 feet of cabin aisle and understood that the override might be real or might not be, and that the 3-minute window was not an ultimatum about the device, but Blake's attempt to reconstruct the psychological control he had just lost, which meant he was operating from a position that was weaker than it had ever been on this flight, and he knew it. Captain Grant's voice came over the cabin speaker again, and it was different this time. Not the managed evenness of a pilot handling a passenger situation, but the clipped efficiency of a pilot managing an aircraft in genuine constraint. Because the fuel state had reached the threshold where a decision about landing sites was no longer the province of the people in the cabin, and the nearest suitable field that was reachable within the remaining margins was not the airfield Blake's ground team was waiting at, and Captain Grant needed everyone secured within 90 seconds. Nolan talked. He talked to Blake the way he might talk to anyone standing at the edge of an irreversible decision, without agenda and without performance, because the most effective thing a person can do in that situation is make the space around the decision feel less contracted than it has become. And the space around Blake's decision had contracted to a very small point in the previous 4 minutes. He talked about Preston Caldwell specifically, the structure of the operation, the timeline of the satellite call, and what had changed in Blake's instructions during that call. The fact that an operation that began as a retrieval had been redesigned during execution to include the elimination of participants, which was not something that happened to assets that Preston intended to protect. He spoke in the tone of a man sharing an analysis rather than making a case, because making a case requires the other person to defend against it, while sharing an analysis only requires them to evaluate it, and Blake was intelligent enough to evaluate accurately. Derek broke from Tobias's hold for a few seconds. Strength in the specific direction of someone who is not accepting restraint, and lurched forward into the aisle, and for one moment the cabin's carefully constructed management fell apart into noise and motion, and Mara put herself between Derek and the forward section of the cabin with the particular decision of someone who has made this choice before and knows what it costs, and 3 other passengers who had not been part of any prior coordination joined her without being asked, because a full cabin of frightened people had been watching this situation for 2 hours and had been building their own resolve in the way that people do when the alternative to acting is worse than the act itself. Tobias and 2 others brought Derek back to the floor of the aisle, and the noise collapsed back to the sound of heavy breathing and the aircraft's engines and the weather outside making its presence known against the fuselage. Vivienne used the disruption. She had spent the entire flight managing the distance between herself and Blake's reach, and the moment his attention fractured toward the rear cabin, she stepped to the side and moved 2 rows toward the cabin's center, and the gap she opened was sufficient. Nolan closed the remaining distance to Blake and managed the override device without activating it, and Blake was on his knees on the cabin floor, and the long architecture of the operation was finished. Trent's voice came from the rear of the cabin, reporting that the interference hardware was disconnected, and the secondary communications were coming back online, and Leah Foster's voice came through the interphone a moment later with a quality that Mara recognized as the specific sound a flight officer makes when they have just received information that changes everything. Confirmation that the aircraft's actual state was different from the state they had been managing from, and that the difference was survivable. The cabin speaker carried Captain Grant's voice a 3rd time, and this time it held something his previous transmissions had been too disciplined to include, which was the early measure of relief. He told them he had the field in sight, and that it was going to be a firm landing, and that he needed the cabin secured immediately. Nolan walked the length of the aisle one last time, checking belts, checking faces, telling people in a steady voice that it was almost finished and that they needed to stay down and hold on. And he was not an authority on this aircraft and had no formal role and no badge and no title, and everyone he spoke to complied immediately because what he had was not authority but the specific quality of credibility that belongs to someone who has been right about enough things in a frightening enough context that the people around them have stopped requiring credentials. He sat down in seat 19A, buckled his belt, and felt his hands trembling against his knees, and he let them tremble because there was no one left to manage the impression of. The aircraft struck the runway with a force that was on the far edge of what commercial landing gear was designed to accept, and the brakes engaged hard, and the reverse thrust came up, and the cabin shook for 8 seconds in a way that erased everything that was not the immediate present, and then the aircraft was rolling, decelerating, the runway lights strobing past the windows in the cabin's dimmed interior, and the sound of the engines winding down was the most precise definition of relief that Nolan had ever heard. Federal vehicles were already on the perimeter. He could see the lights through the portside windows, which meant Leah Foster's restored communications had reached the right people in the right time window, and that Preston Caldwell's ground team at the other landing site was sitting at an airfield waiting for an aircraft that was never going to arrive. The passengers did not cheer in the way that movies suggest they do. They sat in their seats and breathed and held onto each other in the particular way that human beings hold onto each other when they understand that a thing they expected not to survive has ended and they are still present in it. Mara moved through the cabin with the steadiness of someone who had managed the entirety of the crisis, and was now managing its aftermath, checking each row, noting who needed medical attention, assigning the 2 passengers with first aid training to the cases that were urgent and the others to contact with the responding team. Tobias Lane had a cut on his forearm from Derek's second escape attempt that he was managing with the pragmatic efficiency of someone who has seen worse and would see to it later, and Henry Cole sat with his conference lanyard still around his neck and his hands flat on his tray table, doing nothing, which was the most sensible thing available to do. Blake, Derek, and Trent were separated and held in different sections of the cabin by the time the aircraft stopped moving, and when the federal response team came aboard, they found 3 men in various states of cooperation. Derek resistant in the physical way of someone who had run out of alternatives. Blake composed in the way of someone who had already begun calculating what his options were in the next environment. And Trent with his hands out and talking before anyone had asked him to, with the relief of someone who had been waiting for the ordeal to arrive at a stage where cooperation could be formally accepted. The storage device stayed in Vivian's possession, intact, because it had never left her body. The location she had been protecting all along had not been external but internal, a fact that spoke to the level of planning she had applied to this trip and to the thorough underestimation of her that Blake's entire operation had relied upon. In the weeks that followed the landing, the evidence moved through the appropriate channels and found the appropriate destinations. Preston Caldwell was taken into federal custody at his home before he reached the vehicle that would have carried him to a private terminal, and the timing was not accidental. Trent's information, combined with the intercepted communications from Blake's satellite calls, had given investigators everything they needed to close the window before it closed on its own. Ashford Aeronautics entered a period of structural examination that Vivian directed with the same exactness she brought to everything, and the board members whose signatures appeared on the restricted component transfer orders resigned in groups across a period of 6 weeks. She established a formal protection framework for anyone within the company who brought forward evidence of misconduct, and announced it publicly, and the announcement was received as either brave or strategic depending on who was doing the evaluation, and Vivian understood that both were true. She offered Nolan a position, Global Security Director, full authority, a title, and a resource base that matched the scale of what he had actually done. And he declined it, not with the false modesty of someone who wants to be asked again, but with the genuine calculation of a man who knows that his daughter is 15, and that 15 does not stay 15, and that the distance required by a role of that scope was a distance he had already paid the cost of once. He agreed to serve as an independent consultant on a case-by-case basis, which gave him the work without the residence requirement, and Vivian accepted this because she understood that the decision was not about compensation. He was at the arrivals terminal 3 weeks later when Claire came through the doors from a school trip, and she hugged him in the automatic way of a teenager who loves her father but would not want the observation recorded. And then she pulled back and looked at him and said he looked different somehow. Not older, just different in the way that people look when something they have been carrying for a long time is not being carried in quite the same way anymore. He said he had a story to tell her, which was true, and that most of it she was not going to believe, which was also true. Vivian met them in the terminal's open concourse and thanked him in the direct way she did everything. No ceremony, no inflation, and invited both of them to dinner when the schedules aligned. And Claire looked at her father with the expression of someone who has been handed a piece of information she intends to examine carefully at a later time. Outside the terminal's tall windows, another aircraft was lifting off the runway into a pale afternoon sky, climbing steadily into the altitude where Flight 417 had made its choices. And Nolan watched it go and understood something he had been working toward for 4 years. A single mistake does not determine the shape of everything that comes after it, and the man who had stood in the narrow aisle of a seized aircraft and talked 3 desperate people toward better decisions was the same man who had made a terrible call on a Phoenix tarmac. And that was not a contradiction, but simply the whole truth of what one person can be. He was still afraid of flying. He suspected he always would be. But at 30,000 feet, when it had mattered, he had not been alone, and he had not needed to be. The man who once believed he had to be the sole wall between danger and the people he was sworn to protect had finally learned to trust the cabin around him, and in doing so had brought them all safely back to Earth.